affectionately referred to as a Connie. This is a military version that serviced the United States Air Force. It was built in 1954. The plane itself has been parked out here for 10 years. Nothing had been done until about 3 years ago, when tons of volunteers showed up who are out here right now, and we'll be interviewing them in a moment. But let's inspect the plane. Speaking of volunteers, a former flight engineer on the Constellation, not this particular Constellation, but for Flying Tiger Airlines, is going to take us aboard, Hank Germain. Hank, a pleasure. Let's go aboard.
Okay, let's go aboard.
Hank, we're in the cockpit of a Lockheed Constellation. You used to be flight engineer. You're at your desk.
I'm at my,
Just a little bit about it.
well, I'm at my office. This was the heart of the cockpit, that they say in these airplanes. This airplane, in those days, the engineer controlled most of the systems, and that included air conditioning, the fuel, the electrical, keeping the engines running, monitoring the engines for anything that's going wrong with them. We have ignition analyzers that told you what all the spark plugs were doing, how the engine itself is running inside the cylinders. All these gauges are mostly engine instruments and fuel up here on the panel.
Are you the one responsible for actually starting the engine?
It was sort of a joint effort, but the engineer did most of the starting of the engines. It was usually hands on the throttle, and the engine was turned over to make sure the prop turned, and then the mixture was put in, which let the fuel go to the engine. And just prior to that, after 9 turns, you'd yell contact, and the pilot, in this joint effort, would turn the magneto switch on. And then the engineer felt the engine with these controls and got it running into a nice idle, and then checked his pressures and his RPMs and certain readings on the instrument.
What's the longest flight you had to take in these cramped quarters?
The longest flight I spent, well, you got to remember, there's just 2 of us in this airplane. In the days when these airplanes were flying for the airlines, and I flew for Flying Tiger's air freight, we were around the world airline, there were a pilot, co-pilot, an engineer, and a navigator right here. You were talking about
the same size cockpit?
This same cockpit, and if you had a check person on board, you had another guy right here behind the seat. So this little...
You had 5
people, and it wasn't just, a lot of times you did. So you didn't move around much in this airplane. And when the first thing when you walk in it, after being in a larger airplane, you say, my, how small the cockpit is. But it's suitable, and it works. Everything's certainly at arm's length. But there was 5 people in the airplanes at times, and always 4 on overwater flights, because you had to have a navigator. There was no sophisticated navigation systems like we have them now.
Now, Hank, why don't you explain some of the instruments, the gears up here? Because you did retire as a captain.
Oh yes, I worked my way up, as they say, from this seat to the right seat to the left seat, and that's the way it usually works in the airline industry. You start off as flying.
Hop on the flight deck. Hank, about the only thing I know how to operate in here is the ashtray. I don't know what it's doing up there. Now, how does this differ from when you were a captain in a 747? We're a little cramped in here.
You're making me smile a little bit about the ashtray, because in them days, everybody smoked in these airplanes. I smoked, everybody smoked. The airplane was just one big cloud of smoke. And of course, as it advanced to the jets and we got higher altitudes, most of the pilots and everybody got wised up and they quit smoking, so they still have ashtrays, but we really used to use them. The instruments is about the same. I'm not talking about the new glass cockpit. This is nowhere near that sort of display.
You mean where everything is automated?
Everything is, well, everything is automated. Where they, as a matter of fact, don't even have flight engineers in the newer airplanes. Everything is automated with little buttons and a scanning, the visual means of finding out what's wrong with the airplane and correcting it by pressing the button. This is a little more basic, a little more mechanical, but the instrumentation itself is the same. same. I'll start off with the turn and bank. This instrument's been around for years, well into the 30s. One of the few first instruments that let you fly in clouds or blind flying. This is a localizer, or it lets you shoot the approach on a radio beam in all kinds of weather. Probably not the 100-foot minimums you get in the modern airliners, but 300 or 400 feet. These are compasses, or electronic compasses that the modern airplanes have. These are ADF, old radio tune, like you tune your radio, and this will point to the station. That's been around a long time and still found in the newer airplanes.
Are these the original avionics?
These instruments in here right now, and I'm saying this because I can tell by the instrument, the newer instruments are, you can tell they've been upgraded, but these are the original. This is original ADF instrument. This is the original localizer here. But the job it does is the same as what the 747 does, the same approach. You might be doing it on a visual, a glass cockpit, but it does the same thing. Altimeters, and this is the airspeed indicator. As you can see, it's a lot less than the 500 knots you'd see on the Boeing. And then these are the engine instruments the pilot has. Now, this is all the engine instruments he has. It shows the RPM of the engine and the manifold pressure, which tells you how much air how it's performing. The wing flaps, the gauges, and here's your gyro horizon. Somebody was asking about a basic gyro horizon, lets you know your attitude of the airplane. The rest of the instruments he has are the same: rate of climb, clock, of course, you got to know what time it is. But basically, the instrumentation is pretty sophisticated for the time and still used today, and a lot more sophisticated. But the maintenance crew here has done a great job, as you could tell by taking the pictures out there. And yes, they've already ran the engines, and they're starting a taxi test. And this airplane has to be FAA approved to fly. It's got to go through a lot of inspections by the government and by the people that are going to fly it, myself.
Yeah, I appreciate your time, and we're going to see you again before we take this bird off.
Oh, I hope so. I really hope